Well, welcome to the third and final day of our conference. I'll sit here so Jerome can see me. We have three speakers this morning, and then for those who are staying on, we've got the deep time walk in the afternoon. And remember, you have to have checked out of your room by 11. The first speaker this morning is Jerome Bernstein. He's telecommuting in from Santa Fe, and the title of his presentation is Dominion, Reciprocity, and Ecocide. Jerome, take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm going to read for about a minute and a half or 2 minutes, and then I'll talk from the slides. Actually, if we can have slide 3, that'd be good right now. From my Jungian perspective, the archetypal drama represented by the expulsion of Adam and Eve is at the heart of the Garden of Eden story in the Hebrew Bible, which is the foundational myth of Western civilization. I propose that the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden for the sin of eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge resulted in the cleavage of species Homo sapiens from its pre-expulsion and that oneness with nature. And what we have come to know.
Jerome?
Sorry?
Jerome?
Yeah.
Okay, so we had a technical problem. I hate to ask you, could you go back and basically start with the Garden of Eden?
Start after, listen carefully.
Okay?
You want me to go back to the Garden of Eden?
Yes, go back to the Garden of Eden.
Okay.
And get it right this time.
If only. So let me just summarize what I've said. I see the Garden of Eden story, particularly the expulsion, as the foundational myth of Western culture. And to back up, it's a very short opening to that myth. But if we recall, in the beginning of the myth, Adam and Eve are in the garden, and they're naked. And the story in the Bible makes a point of their being naked. And what is that about? And what it's about is that there's no differentiation between humans, the five-fingered, as natives would say, and any other animal in the garden. And furthermore, Adam and Eve don't know that they're naked. And therefore, it's of no issue, except that the drama that follows thereafter, which is the temptation and the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and that's a particular point, the tree of knowledge. The very first thing that happens is they realize they're naked, and it makes a difference. And as I read that story, that moment when they have that conscious awareness of being naked, and the fact that it makes a difference to them because they immediately seek fig leaves to cover themselves, archetypally speaking, that is the moment of the birth of what I call self-reflective consciousness, which is unique to our species alone. And I think that was the telos of it. and the expulsion was to set our species off to develop that self-reflective consciousness, which is unique to our species, right up to the current time. And really the end of the 20th century, at which point that particular evolutionary development has become over-specialized. And I call that over-specialized consciousness, which is no longer as conscious as it is unconscious in many ways. I call that the psychic paradigm of dominion. In earlier writings, I referred to the beginning of the story where Adam and Eve don't know that they're naked and are not differentiated from other animals. In earlier writings, I called that the psyche left behind. And I now refer to that particular dimension of psyche in our species as the reciprocity, the paradigm of reciprocity. So that split from nature ultimately has resulted in the Western psyche's over-specialization and dissociation. Dissociation is really important, which in the present era threatens to take our species over the cliff of global climate change towards annihilation. The symptoms of the latter are an addiction to dominion and power over all life forms, most especially nature, and the commodification of the earth and the resultant loss of Western psyche's spiritual connection with itself and with all of life. That's where we are today. Now, Euro-America has long projected mana onto the indigenous populations of the world, especially Native Americans, as if they had all the answers. They don't. But they do have communication with nature and can speak nature's language. And I'm not speaking primarily metaphorically here or symbolically. I mean literally what I'm saying. Theirs is a psyche that operates on laws and principles different from those of the Western psyche. Heretofore, I've called that psyche left behind, and now refer to it as the psychic paradigm of reciprocity. And it seems that what the Euro-American psyche is seeking is a reconnection and dialogue, a communion with that psyche, and through that, a reparative relationship with nature in its natural, sacralized, spirit-filled, and I would now add, power form, now that we're learning that nature actually is more powerful than the dominion psyche. So those dimensions of traditional native culture and oral traditional language practice carried out today by surviving tribal elders provide one of the few examples of what the psychic paradigm of reciprocity looks like and the nature of its psychodynamics. It cannot be overstressed that the reciprocity paradigm in this context is not an ego choice. We do not have the luxury of saying, well, that's a nice attitude. there's a tendency in the collective to see reciprocity as being nice, and oftentimes it looks that way and feels that way. But psychodynamically, archetypally, that's not the point. The point is it's not an ego choice. What is happening is that dimension of the human psyche that was rendered dormant with the expulsion from the Garden of Eden is a defining characteristic of a long dormant and now indispensable dimension of the human psyche. And it is a law of nature. And I stress the word law. So that archetypally, that is now where we find ourselves. And moving very rapidly, the scientists tell us, towards self-extinction. So let's take a look at the next slide, slide 4. And these, the next 2 slides are the primary characteristics of the psychic paradigm of dominion that I've identified. So it's the logos aspect of psyche, responsible for science, logic, technology, and binary thought. And that's wonderful. For the most part, most of that is quite wonderful. Dominance of left brain consciousness, major characteristic of dominion. Patriarchal monotheism, and that's really important because if you take a look at patriarchal monotheism as represented by the 3 monotheistic religions, they all are power-based origin stories, genesis stories. And it has to do with a greater power than our species deciding what happens. And of course, in the Hebrew Bible, the statement is that we, our species, are made in the image of that patriarchal deity. Cartesian duality, which includes cause and effect, things are black or white, is another characteristic. Splitting without consciously holding the attention of the opposites, and therefore prone to missing the potential for a transcendent function. It typically sees shadow dynamics as pathology. And then the next slide. These I've highlighted because I see them as the most problematic and entrenched characteristics of dominion. It's power-oriented towards supremacy of the ego due to the absence of the mediating influence of a living relationship with nature. That is, it has an archetypal deficit of a capacity for humility. And if ever that was questionable, it sure as hell is pretty obvious today. And the last characteristic, or next to last that I've identified here, is that it denies and is threatened by the idea of an archetypal dimension of reality capable of overriding ego control. That is, it is phobically identified with the principle of dominion. And the last characteristic I've identified here is it's beholden to a man-centered concept of psyche. That is, psyche resides in and emanates from the mind of man. So those, from my point of view, are the salient characteristics of dominion, and if you take them all together, they're pretty self-reinforcing. And really, where we end up today, it ends up elevating the human ego and its power orientation to a level that actually displaces any concept of a transpersonal power greater than our species. And I think renders us in the state that we are in right now, which is addicted to the psychological archetypal orientation of dominion at all costs. And we can see that in the extreme with Trump and the political psychosis that's going on right now. So, and the other thing I want to point out is that the paradigm of dominion is the only paradigm that has been in the collective consciousness predominantly up until now. Obviously, there have been scholars, philosophers, and so forth who have come up with other notions. But for the collective as a whole, for the collective consciousness of Western civilization, that has been the one and only paradigm that has been in the consciousness and has now, from my point of view, become an addiction. No different than drug addiction or any other addiction. So if we can move to slide 6 now, these are the characteristics that I have ferreted out with regard to the psychic paradigm of reciprocity. So the first is it recognizes the state of interdependence between all beings and life forms. Now recall a couple of minutes ago, I said that the remnants of the indigenous populations, the indigenous population that I am most familiar with is Native American. And it's really, really important to have an example, something we can see and experience as a living, expression of the psychic paradigm of reciprocity, because dominion and logic renders these concepts into abstractions. We talk about them, but we don't really have an idea of what the experience is. And although there isn't time to go into it now, I would say that the defensive structure of the dominion paradigm has been overwhelmingly effective in keeping out any awareness of the psychic paradigm of reciprocity. And I think this is a new dimension that is entering in, beginning towards the end of the, that is becoming liminal. That's what I mean when I say entering in. Towards the end of the 20th century is when I began to see it in dramatic form. So the characteristics of that psychic paradigm are: it recognizes the state of independence between all beings and life forms. The right brain is balanced with left brain consciousness. It operates on the principle of balance, harmony, and repair, not fixing. Duality as a balance and harmony, not as splitting. It's a huge, huge problem and major difference. A balance of masculine and feminine energy at all times, in all things. In just a small example of that, in 45 years that I have been relating to the Navajo culture and their ceremonies, etc., particularly their sand paintings. In 45 years, I have never seen a depiction of Father Sky without, in the same frame, a depiction of Mother Earth, and I've never seen one of Mother Earth without Father Sky. Another characteristic is it experiences shadow dynamics as normal, but in need of management. If you think about that psychologically, that's an awesome prospect, particularly right now, where we are being drowned in our own shadow dynamics. Next slide, please. Slide 7. Healing is based on restoration and repair without guilt. There is no need for guilt when the presumption is the need and possibility of restoration. The native languages I am familiar with have no word for guilt. They also have no word for religion. They also have no word for medicine. They're all of a part. The next characteristic I've identified is the principle of restoration does not instinctively seek out the transcendent function because transcendence is inherent in the unsplit archetypal dynamic. And the last is a psychic principle of reciprocity embraces archetypal awareness and a quantum state of time and space. And this latter is really, really important because it brings in a whole other dimension of reality. And I mean that word, reality, not in any metaphorical or symbolic way. And I'll give you one example of that. The Hopi language, Hopi Indian tribe, the Hopi language has no tenses. I mean, think about that. So when a Hopi says something that where they're alluding to something that will take place in the future or in the past, there's nothing in the statement, the words, that direct that. So what does that mean? One would think coming out of the dominion frame, out of the logos frame, that would be chaos, but I'll give you a concrete example. The Hopi language, they have a word, it's one word, and it's used for any female in-law. So, and that word is miwi. So that's your mother-in-law, that's your daughter-in-law, that is your sister-in-law, that is your cousin-in-law, it's your aunt-in-law, and it goes on. And furthermore, when a Hopi woman, I'm now talking in the traditional practice of the religion, that when a Hopi woman marries, how to put it, within that family, her given name is no longer used. So if her name is Alice, once she marries, that name, she's never again called Alice in the family. She's called Miwi. So I came upon this a lot of years ago, 35 years, 40 years ago. when I was in a home of this family that I'm close to. And there, it was after a ceremony, and it's typical after a ceremony to feed the people who participated and the people who attended the ceremony. And so there were 35 or so people there. I don't know, 10 or 15 muleys. And the woman whose house it was, who was a good friend, came up to me and handed me something. And she said, "Would you give this to Muley?" So I got up, went over there, and gave it to Muley. Came back and sat down. And after about 2 minutes, suddenly realized not only had I given it to the right person, but how the hell did I know who the right person was? Because there were about 15 Louis in the room. That's an example. And as Jeff can talk about much better than me, the quantum dimension now is moving into prominence in the world of science, much more liminal now, at a very rapid rate, and is in the process. It's not only changing scientific thought, it's altering the reality that we all live. So that's the last characteristic that I have identified.
Jerome, I just want to
Yes.
interject 5 minutes. Could you wrap up in
Okay.
5?
Okay. Very quickly, I won't go into it now, but all of this started for me in the early 1990s, when I began to realize that the prevailing psychic paradigm was correct.
Because we have 3 of them on there, that's okay. We can get it back again.
This is working. No, the link's ended. The Zoom is ended because we have free Zoom. It's only 30 minutes.
Of his writings. It's a very important word because it's the dynamic that is now governing a lot of the chaos and psychotic process in our collective. And it's Bessonianism, and my definition is a phobic aversion to the transrational dimension of reality. And when you talk about quantum, entering into a quantum reality, that is not a rational process. And the thing about the Dominion psyche is that it cannot tolerate anything that refers to the transrational dimension of reality. And then the last slide I want to go through is the next one, because this is where we are right now. The title of the slide, I'm sure most of you will recognize, is from Einstein, where he referred to quantum physics early on as spooky actions at a distance, and said he couldn't buy it. And so I'll let you look at the slide. I think the slide is largely clear. And this is what's happening right now. This is where we are in the moment. This is the struggle. And and our survival as a species, is dependent on the connection that the collective unconscious is trying to make between the reciprocity paradigm, which is now reawakening, and the dominion. And because out of that dialogue will come a different reality, which may enable us to treat our addiction to dominion sufficiently to survive. And the arena for all of that is ecocide. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Jerome.
So is there time for any discussion or questions?
Yes, there is. Any questions for Jerome? Any one here? You have to come up.
That's okay, I'll get this. Yeah, you have to come over there.
Go over to the phone.
So we have a question.
So I very much appreciate the notion of reciprocity, and it brings to mind also the concept of relational ontology, which is a means of describing animism. And I was just wondering if, especially in light of the final slide, if we could, in the manner of the I Ching, return back to the first slide and view the first slide through the last slide, in which case we could then view this notion of dominion not as a grasping for power that leads to the logos manifestation, but instead look at that dominion as a means of reciprocity in which a very natural hierarchy of constant flowing and return is expressed in precisely the same language as the dominion over the species, in which each one of those species could be representative of a dynamic function that's happening simultaneously.
Absolutely. I think that's a very astute observation. And what you just made me realize is that a word missing from these slides, can't believe I did it, but I did. You're making me aware. It's the word relational. That's a key word. And for example, your point, the point that you're making, is my fantasy. I walk around all the time fantasizing, what would I do if I had the power to do it? If we had a rational president of this country, I would hope that that president would tomorrow issue a statement to Bolsonaro, the president of, is that his name, of Brazil?
Yeah.
And give an ultimatum saying you have 30 days, 60 days to stop the destruction of the tropical rainforest, or we will invade your country. Now, is that reciprocity or dominion? And it's really both.
Wow.
It's really both.
You've left a lot of speechless people here.
Say that again?
There are a lot of speechless people here after making that statement, Jerome.
I think that's exactly, I hope, let me put it this way, I hope that's exactly where we're headed. If what the scientists are telling us, that we have 8 to 10 years at best, and they keep shortening the time, before we lose our option to participate in our own survival, if that really is so, it's going to take us 3-4 years, probably more politically, to undo what Trump has destroyed of their environmental infrastructure and our remediation of ecocide, just to undo what he's done. I mean, this is a can of harm fire that is right at the back door. It's not in the back door. It's already in back of the house, headed towards the front. And so, yeah, it's going to take extreme measures like that. And for our liberals, and I'm one of them, I would be characterized as a leftist. I can barely talk about what's called the migrant problem. I start to talk about it, and I start weeping. But I will tell you that in 3-4 years, you're talking about hundreds of millions of displaced people. And if that doesn't call for extreme, I don't know what does. And of course, that means many, 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 many deaths.
Any other questions? Glenn, I can see your, no? Okay.
Yeah, no.
Okay. Let me challenge you. You said that one of the aspects of reciprocity is not to fix. Would not the action you just stated, isn't that an attempt to fix?
It's an attempt to remediate. One of the things about reciprocity, and people who know me, including Jeff, know that I can be quite a pain in the ass about language. So, for example, in that list that Jeff handed out of 11 propositions that my work is based on, I talk about how the statement that ecocide is human-caused is accurate, but it's not precise. And the precise statement is that it's human psychology that results in the behavior. And if that language is not correct, we don't get to the real causal factor. And when you're dealing with an unsplit archetype, and this is a whole other paper that I've developed, but if you deal with the unsplit archetype in our present dominion frame, we split all archetypes, war and peace, sickness and health, and that's abnormal. The archetype is war-peace. The archetype is peace-war. And so when you have an unsplit archetype, what you have is a dynamic relationship. Thank you to the previous questioner. You have a relationship that is in flux all the time. It's not going to stay the same. It's not going to stay static. And so, from the dominion perspective, it is an attempt to fix. And it may, for a while, like the war to end all wars that we've had, but that's not how it works. And we've got to learn that. We have got to learn it.
Okay, thank you so much, Jerome, for putting up with our technological blips. We really...
Well, it always makes me feel a little less dumb when somebody has a similar problem, because I have colossal problems there, as you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
And thank you for the opportunity to present. And enjoy the rest